June 6, 1944. Oro 4 was ours, the Normandy coast. The darkness here is not empty, it is heavy, pressurized, a tangible substance that presses against the concrete of the Atlantic Wall. Inside bunker WN-29, overlooking the stretch of sand that the maps in Berlin label simply as Mike Sector, Hauptmann Erich Kreuger lights a cigarette. The flame illuminates a face carved from the same grey granite as the bunker walls. Kreuger is a veteran of the Eastern Front. He has seen the frozen hell of Demyansk. He has watched men eat their own boots in the ruins of Stalingrad. To him, this posting in France is a vacation, a sanatorium with guns. He exhales a plume of blue smoke that drifts towards the firing slit, mingling with the salt air of the English Channel. He looks out at the black water. It is calm. Too calm. His men, the 716th Infantry Division, are a mixture of old men with ulcers and young boys with acne, bolstered by Osttruppen, conscripts from the Soviet territories who hate Stalin slightly more than they hate Hitler. They are the stomach battalions, units sent here to digest their rations and man the machine guns until the real war comes. And the real war, according to the High Command, isn't coming here. It's coming at Calais. Or perhaps it isn't coming at all. The weather is atrocious. The waves are chopping against the pilings of the beach obstacles, the Rommel's asparagus, like angry fists. No sane commander would launch an invasion in this soup. Kreuger checks his watch. He thinks of the reports he read yesterday. Intelligence briefings mocking the Allied forces across the Channel. The Americans? Gangsters and cowboys, too soft for the meat grinder of modern war. The British? Tired, spent, an empire in hospice care. And the Canadians? Kreuger smirks in the darkness. The colonials. Lumberjacks and farmers. Amateurs playing at soldiers. The German officer corps, drunk on the myth of Aryan superiority and the memories of 1940, views the Canadian Army as a negligible variable, overrated, undisciplined, a force that will break the moment it touches the steel teeth of the Third Reich. They are wrong. They are catastrophically, lethally wrong. But Kreuger won't know that for another 3 hours. And by the time he realizes his mistake, the amateurs will be standing on top of his bunker, dropping a grenade down his ventilation shaft, 10 miles out to sea. The landing craft assault, LCA 1038, heaves violently in the swell. It smells of diesel, vomit, and wet wool. Inside, 30 men of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles are packed like sardines in a tin can that is slowly filling with water. Private Henry Hank Thompson, a 20-year-old farmhand from Manitoba, is trying to remember the Lord's Prayer. He gets stuck on daily bread. He can't think of bread. He can only think of the weight of the equipment strapping him to the bench. 60 pounds of gear, rifle, ammunition, shovel, gas mask, wet socks. It feels like a lead coffin he is wearing while still alive. He looks across the aisle at Sergeant Arthur Art Wilson. Wilson is older, a man of 30 with eyes that have seen the inside of too many bars and not enough churches. Wilson isn't praying. He is sharpening his bayonet with a small whetstone, the sh-sh-sh sound cutting through the drone of the engine and the retching of the seasick men. Wilson catches Thompson's eye. He doesn't smile. He doesn't offer a platitude. He just nods, a grim, microscopic acknowledgement of their shared doom. They know what is coming. They have seen the aerial photos. They have been briefed on the pillboxes, the mines, the interlocking fields of fire. They know that the softening up bombardment is a gamble. If the Navy misses, they are dead. If the Air Force misses, they are dead. If the coxswain drops the ramp too early, they drown. If he drops it too late, they are machine-gunned. The margin for survival is measured in inches and seconds. Thompson looks at his hands. They are white, the knuckles standing out like marbles. He wonders if he will ever touch a girl again. He wonders if his mother is sleeping right now, back in the farmhouse where the only noise is the wind in the wheat. He feels a sudden, violent urge to stand up and scream, to jump over the side, to swim away from this metal box that is carrying him to the slaughterhouse. But he doesn't move. None of them move. They are Canadians. They don't make a fuss. They do the job, even if the job is dying. 06 hours. The sun begins to bleed into the sky, a sickly grey dawn that reveals the Armada. To To the German sentries on the dunes, it looks like the horizon itself has sprouted ships, thousands of them, a forest of steel masts. The silence of the morning is shattered by a noise that sounds like the sky ripping open. The naval bombardment begins. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, they open fire in a synchronized cataclysm. The sound is not heard. It is felt. It punches the air out of the lungs. It vibrates the teeth in the gums. On the beach, the world dissolves. Concrete bunkers shake like jello. Sand is thrown hundreds of feet into the air, turning into glass shards in the heat of the explosions. Hauptmann Kreuger is thrown to the floor of his bunker. Dust rains down, choking him. The phone line to headquarters is dead. The lights flicker and die. He crawls to the slit. The sea is on fire. Rockets from the landing craft are arching over the water, screaming like banshees. It is a display of industrial violence that the world has never seen. But as the smoke clears, Kreuger sees something that makes his blood run cold. The bunkers are still there, the wire is still there, the mines are still there. The bombardment was too short, it was too fast. The Atlantic wall has been shaken, yes, but it has not been broken. The beast is awake, and it is angry. And now the landing craft are coming. They are small, flat beetles crawling through the surf, heading straight for the killing zones. The approach to Juno Beach is a race against the tide and the clock. The Canadians are landing on a rising tide, which means the beach obstacles, the mines strapped to wooden stakes, are slowly being submerged. The engineers were supposed to clear them. They haven't. The landing craft have to weave through a minefield that is disappearing under the water. LCA 1038 hits a mine. The explosion lifts the 10-ton steel vessel out of the water like a child's toy. It breaks in half. There is no cinematic slow motion. There is just a flash, a roar, and then 30 men are in the freezing water, weighed down by their gear, screaming as the salt water floods their lungs. Thompson is thrown clear. He hits the water hard, the breath driven from him. He sinks. The green gloom envelops him. He struggles, clawing at the buckles of his webbing. His fingers are numb. He is drowning. He is going to die here, 10 feet from France, without firing a shot. Then a hand grabs his collar, a brutal, powerful yank. He breaks the surface, gasping, coughing up bile. It's Wilson. The sergeant is treading water, his face a mask of oil and blood. "Move, you bastard!" Wilson screams. "Swim or sink!" They thrash towards the shore. Around them the water is alive with bullets. The Germans have opened up. The MG-42s, the Hitler's zippers, are tearing the surface of the sea into white foam. Men are hit and simply disappear. Others are hit and float, the life preservers keeping their corpses bobbing in the swell, a macabre buoy, markers for the following waves. Thompson reaches the sand, he crawls. He drags his body over the wet shingle, vomiting water. He looks up. The beach is a slaughterhouse. This is Nan Green sector. The Queen's own rifles are landing here. They were supposed to have tank support. The DD tanks, the duplex drive swimming tanks, are late. The infantry is alone. They are landing directly in front of a fortified strongpoint that has barely been scratched by the bombardment. The ramp of the landing craft next to Thompson drops. A machine gun burst rakes the interior. The first 3 men fall, piling up on the ramp, blocking the exit. The men behind them climb over the bodies of their friends, slipping in the blood, jumping into the surf. They are cut down. It is a massacre, a systematic execution. The German gunners in the pillboxes are firing with the precision of men on a firing range. They are not mocking the Canadians now. They are killing them efficiently, ruthlessly. Private Jack MacDonald, a 19-year-old from Toronto who lied about his age to join up, runs 4 steps and his leg explodes. A 20mm cannon shell has taken it off at the knee. He falls looking at the stump in disbelief. He doesn't scream, he just stares. A medic rushes to him, jamming a morphine syrette into his thigh. "You're okay, Jack. You're going home," the medic lies. MacDonald nods, his eyes glazing over. He dies 3 minutes later, his blood mixing with the tide that is washing over the Canadian boots. But the Canadians do not stop. This is the moment the German officers did not predict. This is the variable they failed to calculate. Any rational army would retreat. Any sensible force would pin down and wait for support. But the Canadians are not rational. They are angry. They are driven by a stubborn, cold fury that has been forged in the Depression years, in the logging camps and the wheat fields. They see their friends dying and they do not cower. They attack. Sergeant Wilson rallies the survivors of his section. "Get off the beach, die up there, not down here," he roars. He grabs a Bren gun from a dead man. He stands up, he fires from the hip, walking into the fire. It is suicide. It is madness. It is magnificent. He suppresses the German gun port for 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, Thompson and 3 others make it to the seawall. They are under the guns now. They are in the blind spot. The amateurs have crossed the death zone. Inside the bunker, Hauptmann Kreuger is shouting orders. "Left flank, more ammo, kill them on the wire." He is sweating. The calm of the morning is gone. These men are not stopping. They are crawling through the wire. They are throwing Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosives, into the obstacles. Boom! A gap opens. Boom! Another gap. They are coming through the smoke like wolves. Kreuger sees a Canadian soldier run towards the bunker, carrying a satchel charge. He shoots him. The man falls, but another one picks up the charge, and another. They are relentless. It is like fighting a tide. You can hold it back for a moment, but you cannot stop it. The realization hits Kreuger with the force of a physical blow. The overrated infantry are not breaking. They are breaking him. The battle for the seawall at Bernières-sur-Mer is a brawl. It is not modern warfare, it is medieval. Men are using entrenching tools as axes. They are using knives. They are using their helmets to bash in skulls. Private Thompson scrambles over the concrete lip of the wall. A German soldier pops up from a spider hole, raising a rifle. Thompson doesn't think. He drives his bayonet into the man's chest. The resistance of the bone, the wet sound of the steel entering the lung, the hot spray of blood on his face. It is a sensation that will rewire his brain forever. He twists the blade. The German screams, a bubbly, gurgling sound. Thompson pulls the trigger. The recoil jars his shoulder. The screaming stops. Thompson stands over the body, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looks around. The beach is a chaotic panorama of destruction, burning tanks, sinking ships, bodies everywhere. But the Canadian flag is moving forward. They are off the beach, they are in the town. The fight for the houses begins. This is where the 716th Division begins to disintegrate. They are prepared for a beach defense, not a house-to-house gutter fight against men who have nothing to lose. The Canadians clear the houses with grenades and Sten guns. They kick down doors. They fire through ceilings. They are learning the trade of urban warfare in real time, paying tuition in blood. In a bakery on the main street of Corseul, Corporal George Fraser of the Regina Rifles encounters a German machine gun crew setting up in the window. Fraser doesn't hesitate. He cooks a grenade, pulls the pin, counts to 2 and lobs it. The explosion blows the storefront out. Fraser walks in through the dust. The Germans are dead. One of them is a boy, no older than 16. He is crying for his mother. Fraser looks at him. He feels a flicker of pity, instantly extinguished by the memory of the bodies on the beach. He steps over the boy and keeps moving. The objective is the railway line, then the airfield, then the road to Caen. They have a schedule to keep. By 10 hours the beach is secured, but secured is a relative term. The sand is still under sporadic artillery fire. The tide is bringing in more dead. The padres are moving among the wounded, giving last rites. The smell of the beach is changing. It is no longer just salt and cordite. It is the smell of open bowels, of burned flesh, of thousands of cigarettes being smoked by men with shaking hands. The logistics train begins to unload. Trucks, jeeps, ammunition crates. The sheer industrial might of the Allies is pouring through the crack the infantry has opened. But the infantry is already miles inland. They are pushing into the hedgerows, the bocage. And here, the war changes again. The open fields of the coast give way to a claustrophobic maze of high earthen banks topped with thick hedges. Every field is a fortress. Every corner is an ambush. And waiting for them in this green hell is not the 716th. It is something much worse. 10 miles inland, near the Abbaye d'Ardenne, SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer stands on the tower of the ancient monastery. He is the commander of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, part of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth. These are not the old men of the coast. These are the children of the Reich, raised on a diet of hate and indoctrination. They are 18 years old. They are fanatical. They are fearless. And they are led by veterans of the Eastern Front who treat war crimes as standard operating procedure. Meyer looks through his binoculars. He sees the Canadians advancing through the grain fields. He does not see men. He sees targets. He sees little fish swimming into the shark's mouth. He turns to his aide. "Let them come," he says. "We will show them what it means to fight the SS." He does not mock them like Kreuger did. He hates them. He views them as a disease that must be excised. His plan is not just to stop them, it is to annihilate them, to leave no survivors, to send a message to the Allies that Normandy will be their grave. Back on the advance line, the North Shore Regiment is moving through the village of Tylerville. It is quiet. Too quiet. The birds are singing. It feels surreal. Private Art Wilson is eating a tin of cold bully beef while walking. He is starving. The adrenaline crash has left him hollow. He turns to the new kid, a replacement named Miller who landed in the second wave. "Keep your spacing, kid, don't bunch up," Wilson mumbles, his mouth full of beef. Miller nods, nervous, clutching his rifle. "Sarge, you think the worst is over?" Miller asks. Wilson swallows. He looks at the hedgerows looming ahead. He looks at the dark, ancient stone of the farmhouses. He feels a prickle on the back of his neck. "No, kid," Wilson says softly. "The beach was the easy part. Now we're in their house." Suddenly the air snaps. A high-velocity crack followed by the dull thud of a bullet hitting meat. Miller's head snaps back. He falls, a neat hole in his forehead. "Sniper." Wilson dives into the ditch. "Sniper, get down!" The section hits the dirt. The shot came from the church tower. Wilson spots the glint of the scope. He points. "Bren, on the tower!" The machine gunner opens up, chipping stone from the belfry. This is the new reality. The enemy is invisible. The enemy is everywhere. The overrated Canadians are about to meet the 12th SS, and the mockery is about to turn into a scream. The advance continues, but it slows. The resistance stiffens. The Canadians are now fighting for every yard. They are tired. They have been awake for 24 hours. They have waded through hell, but they keep going, because they are the spearhead. They are the ones who have to hold the line against the inevitable counterattack, and they know it's coming. They can hear the tanks, the distinct, terrifying squeal of tracks, panzers. The 21st Panzer Division is moving. The 12th SS is moving. The iron fist of the Wehrmacht is winding up for a knockout punch. The Canadians dig in. They dig foxholes in the hard Norman soil. They set up their anti-tank guns. They check their ammo. They wait. In the command post of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the reports are coming in. Juno secure. Advance elements at Elm. Contact with heavy armor. The generals are cautiously optimistic. They have broken the wall. They have established a foothold, but they know the history of amphibious invasions. The beachhead is vulnerable. If the Germans can drive a wedge now, they can push the whole invasion back into the sea. The fate of the world rests on the shoulders of men like Hank Thompson and Art Wilson, men who are currently shivering in a ditch, sharing a cigarette, trying not to look at the body of the kid named Miller. Night falls on D-Day. The sky is lit by flares and the red arcs of tracer fire. The noise never stops. The moaning of the wounded, the distant rumble of artillery. The ocean behind them is still churning with ships, bringing in the lifeblood of the army. But for the infantry, the world has shrunk to the size of their foxhole. Thompson looks at the stars. They are the same stars he sees in Manitoba, but they look colder here. He thinks about the German he killed. He wonders if he will go to hell. He touches the dried blood on his cheek. It flakes off like rust. He realizes he has changed. The boy who got on the boat is dead. The man in the hole is a killer, and he needs to be, because tomorrow the SS are coming, and they are not bringing prisoners. The German High Command is in chaos. Hitler is sleeping, sedated, and no one dares to wake him to release the Panzer reserves. By the time he wakes up, it will be too late to stop the landing. But it will not be too late to start the killing. The 12th SS is moving into position around the villages of Orthy and Buren. They are preparing a welcome for the Canadians, a welcome of fire and atrocities. They are sharpening their knives. They are reciting their oaths. They are convincing themselves that the Canadians are subhuman, unworthy of mercy. This indoctrination will lead to the murders at the Ardennes Abbey. It will lead to the shooting of prisoners in the streets. It will lead to a hatred so deep that it will take 50 years to heal. But on the night of June 6th, the Canadians are the victors. They have done what the Germans said was impossible. They have cracked the Atlantic Wall. They have walked through the fire and come out the other side. They are 15,000 strong on the beachhead, with thousands more pouring in. They are a wedge driven into the heart of Fortress Europe. And they are not leaving. As the moon rises over the smoking ruins of Bernières-sur-Mer, a lone piper from a Highland regiment begins to play. The sound is thin and reedy, drifting over the craters and the corpses. It is a sound of defiance, a sound that says, "We are here." Hauptmann Kreuger is dead, buried under tons of concrete. His mockery died with him. But the war has just begun. The 15,000 men have broken the door down. Now they have to clear the house, and the house is full of monsters. Private Thompson closes his eyes. He tries to sleep, but every time he drifts off, he sees the water turning red. He sees the ramp dropping. He hears the screams. He jerks awake, his hand gripping his rifle. "You okay, Hank?" Wilson whispers from the darkness. "Yeah, Sarge," Thompson lies. "I'm good." Wilson chuckles softly. A dry, humorless sound. "Liar," he says. "None of us are good. We're just alive." And that is the only victory that matters tonight. Being alive. Because tomorrow is another day, and in Normandy a day is a lifetime. The laughable infantry has landed. The overrated colonials have breached the wall. The Germans are no longer laughing. They are loading their guns. The collision between the unstoppable force of the Allied invasion and the immovable object of Nazi fanaticism is about to happen. And the ground zero is the foxhole of Private Henry Thompson. The 96 days of the previous campaign were a nightmare. But this is the apocalypse, and the Canadians are riding the lead horse. The silence of the night is heavy with expectation. The calm before the storm. The 15,000 men breathe in unison. They check their bolts. They wait. For dawn. For death. For victory. June 7th, 1944, D+1. And the sun rises as if nothing happened. As if Juno's sand isn't still chewing on bodies with the tide. As if the channel isn't spitting helmets and limbs back like letters with no address. And along the Canadian line inland, the night doesn't end because the night now lives inside the skull. Hank Thompson wakes in his hole with his jaw clenched and his ear still hearing an MG-42, even when there's only wind. And he learns fast that surviving the first day means the war charges. Interest on the second because Germany isn't beaten. It's only been violently awakened. On the German side, the first light finds the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend moving like a fever, 18-year-olds with glassy eyes and older NCOs carrying the dirty memory of the Eastern Front. And the difference between them and the tired coastal infantry of the 7th and 16th isn't courage, it's doctrine. The kind of belief that turns a prisoner into a target. And in Orthy, the morning doesn't start with trumpets. It starts with tracks crushing hedgerows and the dry crack of test shots. The first contact feels small. Two men seeing each other through a gap in the bocage, a Canadian from the North Shore Regiment, Private Robert Henry Campbell, and an SS Grenadier named Dieter Hahn, and for a heartbeat they're just two young men afraid. But the machine behind Hahn pushes his trigger finger harder than any personal will. Campbell drops with his throat opened and his blood feeding the earth like, "France is collecting an old debt." Art Wilson crawls to him, drags him by the webbing, tries to plug the wound with a palm. But the blood keeps coming hot and dark, and Campbell tries to speak and only air hisses out. And Wilson realizes he isn't holding a wounded soldier. He's holding a body that hasn't accepted being dead yet. In the German rear, the story is already forming that the Canadians were overrated only because they got farther than expected on D-Day, and pride now demands punishment. And punishment becomes local counterattacks and a cruelty that spills onto anyone captured. Because the Hitlerjugend has been raised in a world where the enemy's humanity is treated as weakness. and the bocage is not scenery, but a natural weapon, a living labyrinth of earth walls and roots where every field is a room and every doorway an ambush. So infantry learns what the maps left out, that the enemy doesn't need numerical superiority when every corner can kill 5 men in 2 seconds. Radios. Rasp for support, and support arrives as armor trying to squeeze through narrow lanes. And when a Canadian Sherman appears, the relief lasts only until a Panzerfaust punches into its side and tears steel and flesh the same way, leaving the smell of scorched metal stuck in the nose like guilt. Hank grips his rifle and feels his hands shake, and a match breaks between his fingers because fear has hijacked fine motor control, and he discovers a new kind of shame. Not the shame of cowardice, but the shame of a body that no longer obeys. Villages like Buren and Orthy become grinders, where ground is traded in tiny, bloody increments that don't justify the pile of dead they produce, and by evening nothing feels gained, only missing men and the sense that every house taken is just a new place to die, while the strategic promise of calm begins turning into a sinkhole that swallows men for weeks, and headquarters can quote landing numbers and casualties from tables and official memory, but on the ground numbers become names that don't answer when someone calls them. Thus, a Corporal Harold James Fraser of the Regina Rifles finds a wounded German boy in a barn with a rosary clenched in his hand, and for a second the war offers a thin chance at humanity, but a shot from the far side of the field rings off a Canadian helmet behind him and drops the man without a sound, and that chance evaporates like steam off hot steel, because the SS has already decided the rules, and sometime that afternoon a small group of Canadians is captured with hands raised, and surrender becomes a transaction that assumes laws. Yet Normandy 1944 doesn't guarantee those laws will be honored, and what follows hardens into history as the Ardennes Abbey massacre, Canadian prisoners murdered by elements of the 12th SS away from the fight, killed like paperwork, not combat. It happens in courtyards and corridors where gunshots echo differently because walls are close, and that intimacy makes the crime dirtier because there is no fog of battle to hide behind, only execution. And for Hank, the news arrives as rumor first, then confirmation, and it corrodes something essential. The belief that capture can be a path to survival, and when that belief dies, the war becomes shorter and crueler, because if the prisoner is doomed, the temptation to take no prisoners grows like mold. On the German side, Dieter Hahn isn't a movie monster. He's a young man trained to obey and to believe compassion is betrayal. And when he sees Canadians surrender, he feels a squeeze in his gut. That could be doubt. But the Feldwebel behind him, Otto Reimann, a veteran, turns doubt into an order, the order into a shot, the shot into silence, and Hahn learns in seconds that the worst act can be committed without hatred, only conformity, while Hank learns that guilt and rage do not cancel each other, they stack. The Canadian advance still continues because stopping gives the Germans room to split the beachhead and throw the invasion back into the sea, and breaking the wall becomes not one cinematic blast but a sustained organized flooding of men, fuel, food and steel through the crack infantry has forced open, yet every reinforcement arrives to meet soldiers only 2 days old who already look 2 years older, and that difference of gaze becomes the first internal fracture in any army. The new men believe in return. The old men believe only in survival. At night, patrols move in the hedgerows, and patrols mean hearing footsteps in darkness and deciding whether to fire blind. Because darkness does things to character, and firing blind is also firing into a future where a mistake becomes a face that visits sleep for decades. And on one patrol, Hank shoots a silhouette crossing a field, and only afterward finds a French civilian with bread and milk spilling into the dirt. A bitter parody of the daily bread line he couldn't finish on the boat, and he doesn't scream or collapse. He just kneels and shakes, and Art Wilson hauls him up and whispers not to stare too long, because staring is the first step toward never being able to stop. Fausa, By the next morning, the firefights extend and Carr still sits out of reach, and what should have been a clean thrust becomes a line of attrition where every meter gained feels like a small sentence passed on someone else. German artillery begins to dial in crossroads where ambulances move, and the war kills the men who stitch pieces back together, which is the kind of irony that never becomes a medal. And in a roofless house turned into a casualty post, a Canadian chaplain, Reverend Charles Edward Grant, writes names into a notebook because he understands a man's last words are a document. And decades later, that notebook will be found in a box in a basement with pages stuck by damp but still readable, proving that death doesn't end when earth covers it. Meanwhile, the Ardennes rumors thicken into rage, rage into hardness, hardness into a colder kind of fighting, and the 12th SS keeps pushing with fanatical aggression, a volatile mix of youth and doctrine producing courage. Without prudence and violence without limits, and when that collides with Canadian infantry already carrying dead friends from the surf and the fields, both sides grind down until only instinct remains. Hank develops a symptom that never shows up in bulletins. He hears a bolt cycling in his head even when his hands are still. He sleeps for minutes and jerks awake with his mouth full of dirt because he dreams he's back in the water and tries to breathe, while Art Wilson develops a ritual of checking his magazine every 2 minutes, not as technique, but as a mechanical prayer that he won't be caught empty, the way so many were on D-Day, and the flow through Juno keeps pouring in, proving the wall wasn't broken by a single punch, but by a sustained invasion of material and flesh. The promise of 15,000 men breaking the Atlantic Wall turns into its real meaning, because breaking also means breaking nerves and bones and families, and what rises on the far side is not clean victory, but a landscape of losses no one can add up without nausea, and the second day makes clear what the first only hinted. There is no return to who you were before you stepped onto the sand, and the question is no longer, will we win? It is, what will be left when we do? The third day in Normandy does not feel like the third day. It feels like the third layer of skin being peeled off a living body, because the beachhead is no longer a beachhead, it is a widening bruise, and every Canadian step inland is paid for twice, once in blood and once in the slow theft of sleep. Hank Thompson moves with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles through a morning that smells like wet plaster and cordite, and the bocage is still there, still breathing, still turning simple distances into ambush mathematics, yet the horizon keeps pulling everyone toward the same gravitational object, Caen, the city that was supposed to fall quickly and instead becomes a magnet for artillery, pride, and attrition. Art Wilson watches the new replacements arrive with clean faces and stiff posture, and he hates them for their untouched eyes, then hates himself for the hate, because this is what war does when it can't kill you fast enough. It changes what you are allowed to feel without permission, and the men start learning the unofficial geography of the campaign. Not roads and rivers, but the places where friends died, the hedgerow corner where a Bren gunner vanished, the culvert that swallowed a stretcher, the field where a wounded man begged for water and got rain instead. The Germans in this zone are not a single enemy, they are layers, and each layer has a different flavor of cruelty. The exhausted coastal troops who collapse when pressed, the regular army that fights like a machine that still remembers 1916, and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend that fights like a belief system given rifles. And when rumors of murdered prisoners spread, every Canadian conversation becomes sharper, shorter, more metallic, because a war with rules is one thing, and a war without rules is another, and the Ardennes Abbey murders stop being a location and start being a warning that travels faster than any jeep. Dieter Hahn is still alive somewhere behind the hedgerows, his youth now a liability, because youth means energy, and energy becomes violence when an older man points it. And Feldwebel Otto Reimann keeps telling him the same thing in different words. If you hesitate, you die. If you pity, you die. If you treat the enemy like a man, you die. And Hahn's mind begins to adopt this logic, not because it is true, but because it is simpler than living with fear. And the simplest lies are always the most survivable in the short term. The Canadians dig in and push out, dig in and push out, and the pattern becomes a kind of breathing. Inhale dirt, exhale gunfire, and somewhere in those cycles, Hank starts to notice that his memory is changing shape. The beach is no longer a continuous event. It is fragments. Boots disappearing under surf, a man screaming with no face, the smell of burning rubber, while the present becomes hyper-detailed, every insect buzzing like a potential tracer, every metallic click in the grass like a grenade spoon. And this is the beginning of a psychological economy where the brain spends all its currency on now because the future is too expensive. The orders keep coming. Link up, hold the line, probe forward, and the maps keep lying because the bocage doesn't show up on paper as a wall. It shows up as green shading, a polite cartographic lie that hides how hedgerows turn tanks into coffins and infantry into bait. And when armor tries to push through, the Germans do not need 100 guns. They need one man with a Panzerfaust and enough patience to wait until the turret can't turn. Caen remains contested, and the fight around it intensifies, and every Allied plan to take it faster becomes another way to grind men into the soil, because the city draws divisions the way rot draws flies, and the Canadians, who broke through at Juno and helped solidify the landing, now find themselves holding ground under constant pressure, while the broader Normandy campaign hardens into a slow, brutal struggle for key terrain and road networks. There are moments of movement, but they are always followed by stillness, by that dead pause where men listen for the next shell, and in those pauses, Hank hears things he cannot unhear. The distant, flat thump of artillery like a heartbeat you can't escape, and closer the whisper of a wounded man trying to stay quiet because he knows noise attracts bullets, and it also attracts attention he doesn't want. Pity feels like exposure when you are helpless. At night, the sky fills with flares, and flares turn Normandy into a negative photograph. Hedgerows black, fields silver, bodies as dark stains, and the light makes everyone's hands look guilty. Art Wilson begins keeping count of small, ugly details because it's easier than counting the dead. How many magazines left? How many cigarettes? How many minutes since the last drink of water? And he catches himself muttering routines like prayers. Check the bolt, check the sights, check the men, because ritual is the only substitute for control when chaos refuses to be tamed. The German counterattacks come in jagged bursts, not always intelligent, sometimes furious, sometimes simply compulsory, as if the SS commanders are trying to spend youth like currency before it expires, and when they fail loudly, leaving fields littered with bodies so young that Canadian soldiers briefly see their own brothers, and then look away, because empathy is dangerous. Empathy makes hands slow. One afternoon, a Canadian patrol finds a German runner's satchel, wedged under a broken fence post, and inside is a folded letter and a small notebook, and the letter is addressed in neat handwriting to a mother in Bremen, and it says nothing about killing. It complains about mud. It asks for socks. It promises return, and Hank feels something he hates, recognition, because the enemy's words are not demonic, they are ordinary, and ordinary is what makes it unforgivable, because ordinary men are doing extraordinary harm, and the harm doesn't care whether the hand that did it was once gentle. The notebook disappears up the chain, and later, months later, it will sit in a file drawer, and decades later, it will be found again, and someone will read the pages and realize that hatred is not required for atrocity, only distance and permission, and that realization will be as cold as a wet blanket on the face. Meanwhile, the Canadian line keeps absorbing pressure, and the casualty flow becomes steady enough to feel industrial, as if the landscape itself is manufacturing wounded men, and the medics develop the blank stare of people who have learned to work inside a horror without reacting to it, because reaction costs time and time costs lives. Hank gets his first real fever, the malaria that stalks even France in summer, and he shakes so hard his teeth rattle against each other, and a medic gives him quinine and tells him it will pass. But the truth is, it will never fully pass. It will live in his blood like a souvenir he didn't ask for, and he will learn later that the body remembers war in chemical ways too. The phrase Atlantic Wall starts to sound ironic, because the wall wasn't just concrete on the shore, it was also the German depth defense inland, the mines, the hedgerows, the pre-sighted artillery, the reserves that were late but not absent, and the Canadians who were mocked as overrated are now doing the least glamorous work of modern war, holding, pushing, bleeding, repeating, keeping the breach open so the rest of the Allied machine can keep pouring through. And underneath that operational truth, the personal war deepens. Art Wilson dreams of the sea even though the sea is miles away. He wakes choking, and the first thing he does is reach for his rifle, because his hands have learned that a weapon is a kind of oxygen. Hank begins to flinch at friendly footsteps, because the brain stops categorizing danger correctly when danger is constant, and the men begin to understand that courage is not a bright flame. It is a dull endurance, a willingness to keep moving while feeling hollow. By the time the Canadians push again toward the broader objective lines around Caen, the mood is no longer invasion euphoria. It is grim accounting, and every order is translated by every soldier into the same private question. Who pays for this one? And the answer is always someone, sometimes you, sometimes the kid next to you, and sometimes a civilian whose name never enters any report. When the day ends, the fields are quiet in that unnatural way that follows violence, and the quiet does not feel like peace. It feels like the pause between coughs in a sick man's lungs, and Hank lies in his hole staring at the underside of the hedgerow roots and realizes with an odd clarity that the war has already decided one thing. Even if he survives Normandy, Normandy will not survive inside him without changing what it touches. Continues in Part 4. Part 4. The end of a campaign is rarely an ending. It is usually a relocation of suffering. And Normandy's suffering relocates into memory, into the paperwork of casualty lists, into quiet kitchens where returned men cannot tolerate sudden noises, into marriages that inherit anger they didn't earn. And for Hank Thompson, the war stops being a sequence of battles and becomes a permanent weather system, something that can be sunny on the surface and still raining hard inside the skull. The Canadian advance continues through the long summer, and the narrative of breaking the wall becomes a longer, harsher story of grinding through fortified villages and hedgerow country under artillery that seems to come from the earth itself. And the German officers who once joked about colonial amateurs learn a different vocabulary. Names of Canadian units spoken with caution, the recognition that these men do not melt, they simply keep coming, sometimes slower, sometimes limping, but coming all the same, because the breach at Juno was not a single heroic moment. It was a sustained commitment of men and material that turned a landing into a lodged blade in Fortress Europe. Art Wilson stops writing letters home halfway through a sentence because he realizes every sentence is either a lie or a weapon, and he doesn't want to send either to his mother. So he folds the paper and keeps it in his breast pocket, where sweat turns ink into bruises. And he tells himself he'll finish it later when the war makes sense again, not understanding that it will never make sense. It will only end. The Ardennes Abbey murders do not fade. They fossilize. And the knowledge that Canadian prisoners were killed after capture becomes part of the moral landscape of the front, shaping how men interpret surrender and mercy, and even those who try to hold on to rules feel the rules slipping through their fingers like wet sand, because restraint requires trust, and trust was shot in a courtyard. Dieter Hahn survives longer than he expects. And survival does not feel like victory. It feels like being kept alive to witness what you've become, and he begins to have moments where he sees himself from outside. The boy who once argued about music, now carrying grenades as if they are normal objects. The boy who once feared a teacher, now fears only hunger and artillery, and the dissonance makes him nauseous. But he learns to hide nausea because nausea is weakness and weakness is punished, and thus the cycle continues, not because he believes it, but because it is safer to perform belief than to admit doubt. When prisoners are taken later, when the Canadians finally get their hands on SS men, the urge for revenge pulses like a second heartbeat, and officers have to enforce discipline not only against panic, but against rage, because rage is the easiest fuel a soldier can use and the hardest to extinguish. And the war's darkest irony is that it punishes you for being human, and then punishes you again for becoming less human. Hank watches a captured German teenager shiver in a ditch, and for a second, the boy looks like someone who should be worrying about school, and Hank feels that old recognition again, and he hates it, because recognition feels like betrayal of the dead, and yet he cannot erase it because the enemy's youth is real, and reality is what war weaponizes against you. It forces you to see, and then forces you to act anyway. The months churn forward, and the tactical details blur, but certain images set like concrete. A friend's helmet upside down in a puddle, filling with rain, a cow in a minefield, half alive, screaming in an animal way that sounds too close to a man, A French woman standing in the rubble of her kitchen, holding a cracked plate as if the plate is proof that her life existed. These are not military facts, but they are the true archive because they are what survivors carry when the maps are folded away. When the war finally moves beyond Normandy and the Canadians keep fighting through Northwest Europe, the men tell themselves the worst is behind them because they need a story that moves forward. But the truth is the worst is portable. It fits in the head, it travels light, and in quiet moments, Hank feels it unpack itself without warning. He begins to sleep in fragments, 10 minutes at a time, because longer sleep invites deeper dreams, and deeper dreams invite the surf, and the surf invites drowning, and his body wakes him before the dream can finish him, and this becomes routine, a nightly evacuation drill he will repeat for years after the guns go silent. Art Wilson starts to jump at the sound of a dropped spoon, then laughs too loudly to cover the jump, and the laughter is brittle. It breaks if you touch it, and this is how trauma disguises itself in men trained to be tough. It dresses as humor and calls it resilience. Years later, long after victory parades and medals, after the photographs have yellowed, a box is opened in a basement in Winnipeg, and inside is a damp bundle of paper that smells faintly of mildew and old smoke, and it contains Art Wilson's unfinished letter and a few pages torn from a notebook that Hank kept without admitting he kept it, and the pages record the things they could not say aloud, names, fragments, a line about a French civilian with milk in the dirt, a line about Abby, written like a curse, a line about the sea that ends mid-word because the pen stopped when the shelling started, and the late discovery does not bring closure, it brings proximity, because reading those words is like standing again on the sand with the ramp dropping. And for the family who finds it, the war suddenly stops being history and becomes inheritance. The official story will always emphasize numbers, how many landed, how many were lost, how the breach was held and expanded, and those numbers matter because they anchor truth against myth. But they also fail, because no number can recreate the moment Hank realized his hands could kill, or the moment Art realized his mind had become a permanent outpost, and yet the numbers remain as a kind of blunt honesty. Canada committed massive forces at Juno and paid heavily, and that payment helped make the liberation of Western Europe possible, even as the cost hollowed out the men who paid it. The German mockery that began as confidence ends as a quieter understanding in those who survive. The Canadians were not overrated, they were underestimated, and underestimation is the oldest sin in war because it turns planning into wishful thinking, and wishful thinking into graves. When the documentary camera, decades later, pans over the calm surf at Courseulles-sur-Mer, the sea looks innocent, but the narrator knows innocence is a temporary condition, and the sand still holds what it was fed, and the wind still moves across the same ground where 15,000 men came ashore and proved that walls do not fail only from explosions, they fail from persistence, from bodies that keep advancing even when reason says stop. Hank Thompson grows old with a kind of quiet discipline, the discipline of a man who learned early that emotion can drown you faster than water, and when he attends remembrance ceremonies, he does not speak much, because speech risks polishing the story into something tolerable, and he refuses to make it tolerable, not out of bitterness but out of fidelity to the dead. Art Wilson, if he survives long enough to become a name on a memorial instead of a man in a field, is remembered by family as difficult, because trauma often gets translated by civilians into temperament, and the truth is simpler and uglier. The war followed him home and moved into his nervous system. Dieter Hahn, on his side, becomes an old man in a rebuilt Germany who avoids churches because stone corridors echo like courtyards, and he never uses the word abbey, and when he hears young people talk about war like it's a movie, he feels something like panic because he knows how quickly ordinary boys can be converted into instruments if you give them a uniform, a slogan, and permission. In the end, the Atlantic Wall is broken, yes, and the breach becomes a flood, and the Reich eventually collapses. But the victory is never clean at the level that matters most, because for the infantryman, the war is not a timeline of operations, it is a collection of irreversible moments, and the most tragic irony is that the men who did what was necessary are the men who spend the rest of their lives paying for what was necessary. The screen fades to black, and the sound that remains is not triumph, not applause, not speeches, but surf, steady and indifferent, and beneath it, if you listen closely enough, the faint click of a bolt being cycled by hands that still can't stop preparing for a day that ended decades ago. The end of a campaign is rarely an ending. It is usually the relocation of suffering, and Normandy's suffering relocates into memory, into casualty lists, into quiet kitchens where returned men cannot tolerate. Sudden noises, into marriages that inherit anger they never earned. And for Hank Thompson, the war stops being a sequence of days and becomes a permanent weather system, bright on the surface and still raining hard inside the skull. The Canadian breach at Juno, held and widened under fire, is not a single heroic photograph, but a sustained, grinding commitment of men and material that turns a landing into a lodged blade inside Fortress Europe. And that truth is the least cinematic part of victory, because it is made of repetition. Unload, advance, dig, bleed, replace, advance again. The German officers who once treated Canadian infantry like an overrated colonial footnote learn a different vocabulary, not admiration, not romance, just a hard operational respect. These men do not melt. They keep moving, sometimes slower, sometimes limping, but moving. And the wall fails not because concrete is weak, but because persistence is stronger than any fixed line. Hart Wilson stops writing letters halfway through a sentence because every sentence is either a lie or a weapon, and he refuses to send either to his mother. So he folds the paper and keeps it in his breast pocket, where sweat turns ink into bruises, telling himself he will finish it when the war makes sense again, not understanding that war never makes sense, it only ends. The Ardennes Abbey murders do not fade, they fossilize, and the knowledge that Canadian prisoners were killed after capture becomes part of the moral terrain of the front, shaping how men interpret surrender and mercy, because restraint requires trust, and trust was shot in a courtyard. That single fact poisons the air in a way artillery cannot, because it forces every soldier to ask what rules mean when the other side has decided rules are optional, and it pushes the whole machine toward a colder, simpler brutality that officers have to fight against inside their own ranks. Dieter Hahn, on the German side, survives longer than he expects, and survival does not feel like victory. It feels like being kept alive to witness what you've become, a young man who learned that the worst acts do not require hatred, only distance and permission, only a voice behind you saying, do it. Hank watches captured German teenagers shake in ditches and feels the sick recognition that the enemy's youth is real. And he hates the recognition because it feels like betrayal of the dead, yet he cannot erase it, because reality is what war weaponizes. It forces you to see and then forces you to act anyway. The months grind forward, and the tactical details blur, but certain images set like concrete. A friend's helmet upside down in a puddle filling with rain. A cow half alive in a mined pasture screaming in an animal way that sounds too close to a man. A Frenchwoman in the rubble of her kitchen holding a cracked plate as if the plate is proof her life existed. And these are not military facts, but they become the true archive because they are what survivors carry when maps are folded away. The official story will always emphasize numbers. How many landed, how many were lost, how the beachhead was secured and expanded. And those numbers matter because they anchor truth against myth. But they also fail because no number can recreate the moment Hank realized his hands could kill, or the moment Art realized his mind had become a permanent outpost that would never be demobilized. Canada's role at Juno is remembered as part of the wider Allied landing that broke into occupied France, but in the infantryman's body it is remembered as salt water, shrapnel sand, and the smell of blood warming under wool. And the irony is that the men who did what was necessary spend the rest of their lives paying for what was necessary. Years later, a box is opened in a basement in Winnipeg, and inside is a damp bundle of paper that smells faintly of mildew and old smoke, and it contains Art Wilson's unfinished letter and a few pages torn from a notebook Hank kept, without admitting he kept it. Pages recording what they could not say aloud. Names, fragments, a line about a French civilian with milk in the dirt, a line about Abbey written like a curse, a line about the sea ending mid-word because the pen stopped when the shelling started, and the late discovery does not bring closure. It brings proximity because reading those words is like standing again on the sand with the ramp dropping. The Atlantic Wall, in the end, is broken, yes, and the breach becomes a flood. But the victory is never clean at the level that matters most, because for the infantryman the war is not a timeline of operations, it is a collection of irreversible moments, each one a small amputation of the self. The German mockery that began as confidence ends as a quieter understanding in those who survive. The Canadians were not overrated, they were underestimated. And underestimation is the oldest sin in war, because it turns planning into wishful thinking, and wishful thinking into graves. Hank Thompson grows old with the quiet discipline of a man who learned early that emotion can drown you faster than water, and when he attends remembrance ceremonies, he does not speak much because speech risks polishing the story into something tolerable, and he refuses to make it tolerable, not out of bitterness but out of fidelity to the dead. Art Wilson, if he survives long enough to become a name on a memorial instead of a man in a field, is remembered by family as difficult because civilians translate trauma into temperament, and the truth is uglier. The war followed him home and moved into his nervous system. Dieter Hahn becomes an old man in a rebuilt Germany who avoids stone courtyards because footsteps echo like executions. And he never uses the word abbey, and when young people talk about war like it is a movie, he feels something like panic because he knows how quickly ordinary boys can be converted into instruments if you give them a uniform, a slogan, and permission. The camera, decades later, pans over the calm surf at Courseulles-sur-Mer, and the sea looks innocent, but innocence is a temporary condition, and the sand still holds what it was fed, and the wind still moves over the same ground where thousands came ashore, and proved that walls do not fail only from explosions. They fail from persistence, from bodies that keep advancing even when reason says stop. The screen fades to black, and the sound that remains is not triumph, not speeches, not applause, but surf, steady and indifferent, and beneath it, if you listen long enough, the faint click of a bolt being cycled by hands that still cannot stop preparing for a day that ended decades ago